This is a continuation of The Warlord of Mars by Edgar Burroughs, comprising chapters 7 and 8. New allies. Surrounded by guardsmen, I marched back along the corridors of the palace of Kulantith, Jeddak of Kul, to the great audience chamber in the center of the massive structure. As I entered the brilliantly lighted apartment, filled with the nobles of Kul and the officers of the visiting Jeddak, all eyes were turned upon me. Upon the great dais at the end of the chamber stood 3 thrones, upon which sat Kulantith and his 2 guests, Matai Shang and the visiting Jeddak. Up the broad center aisle we marched beneath deadly silence, and at the foot of the thrones we halted. "Prefer thy charge," said Kulantith, turning to one who stood among the nobles at his right, and then Thurid, the black dater of the firstborn, stepped forward and faced me. "Most noble Jeddak," he said, addressing Kulantith, "from the first I suspected the stranger within thy palace. Your description of his fiendish prowess tallied with that of the archenemy of truth upon Barsoom. But that there might be no mistake, I dispatched a priest of your own holy cult to make the test that should pierce his disguise and reveal the truth. Behold the result." And Thurid pointed a rigid finger at my forehead. All eyes followed the direction of that accusing digit. I alone seemed at a loss to guess what fatal sign rested upon my brow. The officer beside me guessed my perplexity, and as the brows of Kulantith darkened in a menacing scowl as his eyes rested upon me, the noble drew a small mirror from his pocket pouch and held it before my face. One glance at the reflection it gave back to me was sufficient. From my forehead the hand of the sneaking Thurn had reached out through the concealing darkness of my bedchamber and wiped away a patch of the disguising red pigment as broad as my palm. Beneath showed the tanned texture of my own white skin. For a moment Thurid ceased speaking, to enhance, I suspect, the dramatic effect of his disclosure. Then he resumed. "Here, O Kulantith," he cried, "is he who has desecrated the temples of the gods of Mars, who has violated the persons of the holy Thurns themselves and turned a world against its age-old religion. Before you in your power, Jeddak of Kul, defender of the holies, stands John Carter, Prince of Helium." Kulantith looked toward Matai Shang as though for corroboration of these charges. The holy Thurn nodded his head. "It is indeed the arch-blasphemer," he said. "Even now he has followed me to the very heart of thy palace, Kulantith, for the sole purpose of assassinating me. He lies," I cried. "Kulantith, listen that you may know the truth. Listen while I tell you why John Carter has followed Matai Shang to the heart of thy palace. Listen to me as well as to them, and then judge if my acts be not more in accord with true Barsoomian chivalry and honor than those of these revengeful devotees of the spurious creeds from whose cruel bonds I have freed your planet." "Silence," roared the Jeddak, leaping to his feet and laying his hand upon the hilt of his sword. "Silence, blasphemer. Kulantith need not permit the air of his audience chamber to be defiled by the heresies that issue from your polluted throat to judge you. You stand already self-condemned. It but remains to determine the manner of your death. Even the service that you rendered the arms of Kul shall avail you not. It was but a base subterfuge whereby you might win your way into my favor and reach the side of this holy man whose life you craved. To the pits with him," he concluded, addressing the officer of my guard. Here was a pretty pass indeed. What chance had I against a whole nation? What hope for me of mercy at the hands of the fanatical Kulantith with such advisors as Matai Shang and Thurid? The black grinned malevolently in my face. "You shall not escape this time, Earthman," he taunted. The guards closed toward me. A red haze blurred my vision. The fighting blood of my Virginian sires coursed hot through my veins. The lust of battle in all its mad fury was upon me. With a leap I was beside Thurid, and ere the devilish smirk had faded from his handsome face I had caught him full upon the mouth with my clenched fist, and as the good old American blow landed, the black dater shot back a dozen feet, to crumple in a heap at the foot of Kulantith's throne, spitting blood and teeth from his hurt mouth. Then I drew my sword and swung round on guard to face a nation. In an instant the guardsmen were upon me, but before a blow had been struck a mighty voice rose above the din of shouting warriors, and a giant figure leaped from the dais beside Kulantith and, with drawn long sword, threw himself between me and my adversaries. It was the visiting Jeddak. "Hold," he cried. "If you value my friendship, Kulantith, and the age-old peace that has existed between our peoples, call off your swordsmen, for wherever or against whomsoever fights John Carter, Prince of Helium, there beside him, and to the death fights Thuvandine, Jeddak of Parth." The shouting ceased and the menacing points were lowered as 1,000 eyes turned first toward Thuvandine in surprise, and then toward Kulantith in question. At first the Jeddak of Kael went white in rage, but before he spoke he had mastered himself, so that his tone was calm, and even as befitted intercourse between two great Jeddaks. Thuvendine, he said slowly, must have great provocation thus to desecrate the ancient customs which inspire the deportment of a guest within the palace of his host. Lest I too should forget myself as has my royal friend, I should prefer to remain silent until the Jeddak of Parth has won from me applause for his action by relating the causes which provoked it. I could see that the Jeddak of Parth was of half a mind to throw his medal in Kulantith's face, but he controlled himself even as well as had his host. None knows better than Thuvendine, he said, the laws which govern the acts of men in the domains of their neighbors, but Thuvendine owes allegiance to a higher law than these, the law of gratitude. Nor to any man upon Barsoom does he owe a greater debt of gratitude than to John Carter, Prince of Helium. Years ago, Kulantith, he continued, upon the occasion of your last visit to me, you were greatly taken with the charms and graces of my only daughter, Thuvia. You saw how I adored her, and later you learned that, inspired by some unfathomable whim, she had taken the last, long, voluntary pilgrimage upon the cold bosom of the mysterious Is, leaving me desolate. Some months ago I first heard of the expedition which John Carter had led against Isis in the Holy Therns. Faint rumors of the atrocities reported to have been committed by the Therns upon those who for countless ages have floated down the mighty Is came to my ears. I heard that thousands of prisoners had been released, few of whom dared to turn to their own countries owing to the mandate of terrible death which rests against all who return from the valley door. For a time I could not believe the heresies which I heard, and I prayed that my daughter Thuvia might have died before she ever committed the sacrilege of returning to the outer world. But then my father's love asserted itself, and I vowed that I would prefer eternal damnation to further separation from her if she could be found. So I sent emissaries to Helium, and to the court of Shodar, Jeddak of the firstborn, and to him who now rules those of the third nation that have renounced their religion. And from each and all I heard the same story of unspeakable cruelties and atrocities perpetrated upon the poor defenseless victims of their religion by the Holy Therns. Many there were who had seen or known my daughter, and from Therns who had been close to Matai Shang I learned of the indignities that he personally heaped upon her, and I was glad when I came here to find that Matai Shang was also your guest, for I should have sought him out had it taken a lifetime. More too I heard, and that of the chivalrous kindness that John Carter had accorded my daughter. They told me how he fought for her and rescued her, and how he spurned escape from the savage war-hounds of the south, sending her to safety upon his own throat and remaining upon foot to meet the green warriors. Can you wonder, Kulantith, that I am willing to jeopardize my life, the peace of my nation, or even your friendship, which I prize more than aught else, to champion the Prince of Helium? For a moment Kulantith was silent. I could see by the expression of his face that he was sore perplexed. Then he spoke. Thuvendine, he said, and his tone was friendly though sad. Who am I to judge my fellow man? In my eyes the father of Therns is still holy, and the religion which he teaches the only true religion. But were I faced by the same problem that has vexed you, I doubt not that I should feel and act precisely as you have. In so far as the Prince of Helium is concerned I may act, but between you and Matai Shang my only office can be one of conciliation. The Prince of Helium shall be escorted in safety to the boundary of my domain ere the sun is set again, where he shall be free to go whither he will, but upon pain of death must he never again enter the land of Kael. If there be a quarrel between you and the father of Therns, I need not ask that the settlement of it be deferred until both have passed beyond the limits of my power. Are you satisfied, Thuvendine? The Jeddak of Parth nodded his assent, but the ugly scowl that he bent upon Matai Shang harbored ill for that pasty-faced godling. The Prince of Helium is far from satisfied, I cried, breaking rudely in upon the beginnings of peace, for I had no stomach for peace at the price that had been named. I have escaped death in a dozen forms to follow Matai Shang and overtake him, and I do not intend to be led, like a decrepit though, to the slaughter, from the goal that I have won by the prowess of my sword arm and the might of my muscles. Nor will Thuvendine, Jeddak of Parth, be satisfied when he has heard me through. Do you know why I have followed Matai Shang and Thurid the Black Dater, from the forests of the valley door across half a world through almost insurmountable difficulties? Think you that John Carter, Prince of Helium, would stoop to assassination? Can Kulantith be such a fool as to believe that lie, whispered in his ear by the holy Thurn, or Dater Thurid? I do not follow Matai Shang to kill him, though the god of mine own planet knows that my hands itch to be at his throat. I follow him, Thuvendine, because with him are two prisoners, my wife, Deja Thoris, Princess of Helium, and your daughter, Thuvia of Pardoth. Now think you that I shall permit myself to be led beyond the walls of Call, unless the mother of my son accompanies me, and thy daughter be restored?" Thuvandine turned upon Kulantith. Rage flamed in his keen eyes, but by the masterfulness of his self-control he kept his tones level as he spoke. "Knew you this thing, Kulantith?" he asked. "Knew you that my daughter lay a prisoner in your palace?" "He could not know it," interrupted Matai Shang, white with what I am sure was more fear than rage. "He could not know it, for it is a lie." I would have had his life for that upon the spot, but even as I sprang toward him, Thuvandine laid a heavy hand upon my shoulder. "Wait," he said to me, and then to Kulantith, "It is not a lie. This much have I learned of the Prince of Helium, he does not lie. Answer me, Kulantith, I have asked you a question." "3 women came with the father of Therns," replied Kulantith, "Pador his daughter, and 2 who were reported to be her slaves. If these be Thuvia of Parth and Dejathoris of Helium, I did not know it, I have seen neither. But if they be, then shall they be returned to you on the morrow." As he spoke, he looked straight at Matai Shang, not as a devotee should look at a high priest, but as a ruler of men looks at one to whom he issues a command. It must have been plain to the father of Therns, as it was to me, that the recent disclosures of his true character had done much already to weaken the faith of Kulantith, and that it would require but little more to turn the powerful Jeddak into an avowed enemy. But so strong are the seeds of superstition that even the great Kolian still hesitated to cut the final strand that bound him to his ancient religion. Matai Shang was wise enough to seem to accept the mandate of his follower, and promised to bring the 2 slave women to the audience chamber on the morrow. "It is almost morning now," he said, "and I should dislike to break in upon the slumber of my daughter, or I would have them fetched at once that you might see that the Prince of Helium is mistaken." And he emphasized the last word in an effort to affront me so subtly that I could not take open offense. I was about to object to any delay, and demand that the Princess of Helium be brought to me forthwith, when Thuvandine made such insistence seem unnecessary. "I should like to see my daughter at once," he said, "but if Kulantith will give me his assurance that none will be permitted to leave the palace this night, and that no harm shall befall either Dejathoris or Thuvia of Parth between now and the moment they are brought into our presence in this chamber at daylight, I shall not insist." "None shall leave the palace tonight," replied the Jeddak of Kaul, "and Matai Shang will give us assurance that no harm will come to the 2 women. The Thurn assented with a nod. A few moments later, Kulantith indicated that the audience was at an end, and at Thuvandine's invitation I accompanied the Jeddak of Tarth to his own apartments, where we sat until daylight, while he listened to the account of my experiences upon his planet, and to all that had befallen his daughter during the time that we had been together. I found the father of Thuvia a man after my own heart, and that night saw the beginning of a friendship which has grown until it is second only to that which obtains between Tars Tarkas, the Green Jeddak of Thark, and myself. The first burst of Mars's sudden dawn brought messengers from Kulantith, summoning us to the audience chamber where Thuvandine was to receive his daughter after years of separation, and I was to be reunited with the glorious daughter of Helium after an almost unbroken separation of 12 years. My heart pounded within my bosom, until I looked about me in embarrassment. So sure was I that all within the room must hear. My arms ached to enfold once more the divine form of her whose eternal youth and undying beauty were but outward manifestations of a perfect soul. At last the messenger dispatched to fetch Matai Shang returned. I craned my neck to catch the first glimpse of those who should be following, but the messenger was alone. Halting before the throne, he addressed his Jeddak in a voice that was plainly audible to all within the chamber. "O Kulantith, mightiest of Jeddaks," he cried, "after the fashion of the court, your messenger returns alone, for when he reached the apartments of the father of Therns he found them empty, as were those occupied by his suite." Kulantith went white. A low groan burst from the lips of Thuvandine, who stood next me, not having ascended the throne which awaited him beside his host. For a moment the silence of death reigned in the great audience chamber of Kulantith, Jeddak of Kael. It was he who broke the spell. Rising from his throne, he stepped down from the dais to the side of Thuvandine. Tears dimmed his eyes as he placed both his hands upon the shoulders of his friend. "O Thuvandine," he cried, "that this should have happened in the palace of thy best friend. With my own hands would I have wrung the neck of Matai Shang had I guessed what was in his foul heart. Last night my lifelong faith was weakened, this morning it has been shattered, but too late, too late. To wrest your daughter and the wife of this royal warrior from the clutches of these archfiends you have, but to command the resources of a mighty nation, for all Kael is at your disposal. What may be done? Say the word." First I suggested, let us find those of your people who be responsible for the escape of Matai Shang and his followers. Without assistance on the part of the palace guard, this thing could not have come to pass. Seek the guilty, and from them force an explanation of the manner of their going and the direction they have taken. Before Kulintith could issue the commands that would initiate the investigation, a handsome young officer stepped forward and addressed his Jedak. "O Kulintith, mightiest of Jedaks," he said, "I alone be responsible for this grievous error. Last night it was I who commanded the palace guard. I was on duty in other parts of the palace during the audience of the early morning, and knew nothing of what transpired then, so that when the father of Thurn summoned me and explained that it was your wish that his party be hastened from the city because of the presence here of a deadly enemy, who sought the holy Hecador's life, I did only what a lifetime of training has taught me was the proper thing to do. I obeyed him, whom I believe to be the ruler of us all, mightier even than thou, mightiest of Jedaks. Let the consequences and the punishment fall on me alone, for I alone am guilty. Those others of the palace guard who assisted in the flight did so under my instructions." Kulintith looked first at me and then at Thuvandine, as though to ask our judgment upon the man, but the error was so evidently excusable that neither of us had any mind to see the young officer suffer for a mistake that any might readily have made. "How left they?" asked Thuvandine, "and what direction did they take?" "They left as they came," replied the officer, "upon their own flyer. For some time after they had departed, I watched the vessel's lights, which vanished finally due north." "Where north could Matai Shang find an asylum?" asked Thuvandine of Kulintith. For some moments the Jedak of Kaul stood with bowed head, apparently deep in thought. Then a sudden light brightened his countenance. "I have it," he cried. "Only yesterday Matai Shang let drop a hint of his destination, telling me of a race of people unlike ourselves who dwell far to the north. They, he said, had always been known to the holy Thurns and were devout and faithful followers of the ancient cult. Among them would he find a perpetual haven of refuge, where no lying heretics might seek him out. It is there that Matai Shang has gone. And in all Kaul there be no flyer wherein to follow," I cried. "Nor nearer than Parth," replied Thuvandine. "Wait," I exclaimed. "Beyond the southern fringe of this great forest lies the wreck of the Thurn flyer which brought me that far upon my way. If you will loan me men to fetch it, and artificers to assist me, I can repair it in 2 days. Kulintith." I had been more than half suspicious of the seeming sincerity of the Kalian Jedak's sudden apostasy, but the alacrity with which he embraced my suggestion, and the dispatch with which a force of officers and men were placed at my disposal entirely removed the last vestige of my doubts. 2 days later the flyer rested upon the top of the watchtower, ready to depart. Thuvandine and Kulintith had offered me the entire resources of 2 nations. Millions of fighting men were at my disposal, but my flyer could hold but one other than myself and Woola. As I stepped aboard her, Thuvandine took his place beside me. I cast a look of questioning surprise upon him. He turned to the highest of his own officers who had accompanied him to Kael. "To you I entrust the return of my retinue to Parth," he said. "There my son rules ably in my absence. The Prince of Helium shall not go alone into the land of his enemies. I have spoken. Farewell." Through the Carrion Caves, straight toward the north, day and night, our destination compass led us after the fleeing flyer upon which it had remained set since I first attuned it after leaving the Thurn fortress. Early in the second night we noticed the air becoming perceptibly colder, and from the distance we had come from the equator were assured that we were rapidly approaching the North Arctic region. My knowledge of the efforts that had been made by countless expeditions to explore that unknown land bade me to caution, for never had flyer returned who had passed to any considerable distance beyond the mighty ice barrier that fringes the southern hem of the frigid zone. What became of them none knew, only that they passed forever out of the sight of man into that grim and mysterious country of the pole. The distance from the barrier to the pole was no more than a swift flyer should cover in a few hours, and so it was assumed that some frightful catastrophe awaited those who reached the Forbidden Land, as it had come to be called by the Martians of the outer world. Thus it was that I went more slowly as we approached the barrier, for it was my intention to move cautiously by day over the ice pack that I might discover, before I had run into a trap, if there really lay an inhabited country at the North Pole, for there only could I imagine a spot where Matai Shang might feel secure from John Carter, Prince of Helium. We were flying at a snail's pace, but a few feet above the ground, literally feeling our way along through the darkness, for both moons had set, and the night was black with the clouds that are to be found only at Mars's 2 extremities. Suddenly a towering wall of white rose directly in our path, and though I threw the helm hard over and reversed our engine, I was too late to avoid collision. With a sickening crash we struck the high looming obstacle 3/4 on. The flyer reeled half over, the engine stopped as the patched buoyancy tanks burst, and we plunged head foremost to the ground 20 feet beneath. Fortunately, none of us was injured, and when we had disentangled ourselves from the wreckage, and the lesser moon had burst again from below the horizon, we found that we were at the foot of a mighty ice barrier, from which outcropped great patches of the granite hills which hold it from encroaching farther toward the south. What fate! With the journey all but completed, to be thus wrecked upon the wrong side of that precipitous and unscalable wall of rock and ice. I looked at the Van Dien. He but shook his head dejectedly. The balance of the night we spent shivering in our inadequate sleeping silks and furs upon the snow that lies at the foot of the ice barrier. With daylight, my battered spirits regained something of their accustomed hopefulness, though I must admit that there was little enough for them to feed upon. "What shall we do?" asked the Van Dien. "How may we pass that which is impassable?" "First, we must disprove its impassability," I replied. "Nor shall I admit that it is impassable before I have followed its entire circle and stand again upon this spot, defeated. The sooner we start, the better, for I see no other way, and it will take us more than a month to travel the weary, frigid miles that lie before us." For 5 days of cold and suffering and privation we traversed the rough and frozen way which lies at the foot of the ice barrier. Fierce, fur-bearing creatures attacked us by daylight and by dark. Never for a moment were we safe from the sudden charge of some huge demon of the north. The Apt was our most consistent and dangerous foe. It is a huge, white-furred creature with 6 limbs, 4 of which, short and heavy, carry it swiftly over the snow and ice, while the other 2, growing forward from its shoulders on either side of its long, powerful neck, terminate in white, hairless hands with which it seizes and holds its prey. Its head and mouth are more similar in appearance to those of a hippopotamus than to any other earthly animal, except that from the sides of the lower jawbone 2 mighty horns curve slightly downward toward the front. Its 2 huge eyes inspired my greatest curiosity. They extend in 2 vast, oval patches from the center of the top of the cranium down either side of the head to below the roots of the horns, so that these weapons really grow out from the lower part of the eyes, which are composed of several thousand asig each. This eye structure seemed remarkable in a beast whose haunts were upon a glaring field of ice and snow, and though I found upon minute examination of several that we killed that each ocellus is furnished with its own lid, and that the animal will close as many of the facets of his huge eyes as he chooses, yet I was positive that nature had thus equipped him, because much of his life was to be spent in dark, subterranean recesses. Shortly after this we came upon the huge Apt that we had seen. The creature stood fully 8 feet at the shoulder, and was so sleek and clean and glossy that I could have sworn that he had but recently been groomed. He stood head-on eyeing us as we approached him, for we had found it a waste of time to attempt to escape the perpetual bestial rage which seems to possess these demon creatures, who rove the dismal north, attacking every living thing that comes within the scope of their far-seeing eyes. Even when their bellies are full, and they can eat no more, they kill purely for the pleasure which they derive from taking life. And so when this particular Apt failed to charge us, and instead wheeled and trotted away as we neared him, I should have been greatly surprised had I not chanced to glimpse the sheen of a golden collar about its neck. Du Van Dien saw it too, and it carried the same message of hope to us both. Only man could have placed that collar there, and as no race of Martians of which we knew aught ever had attempted to domesticate the ferocious Apt, he must belong to a people of the north of whose very existence we were ignorant, possibly to the fabled yellow men of Barsoom, that once powerful race which was supposed to be extinct, though sometimes by theorists thought still to exist in the frozen north. Simultaneously we started upon the trail of the great beast. Woola was quickly made to understand our desires, so that it was unnecessary to attempt to keep in sight of the animal, whose swift flight over the rough ground soon put him beyond our vision. For the better part of 2 hours the trail paralleled the barrier, and then suddenly turned toward it through the roughest and seemingly most impassable country I ever had beheld. Enormous granite boulders blocked the way on every hand, deep rifts in the ice threatened to engulf us at the least misstep, and from the north a slight breeze wafted to our nostrils an unspeakable stench that almost choked us. For another 2 hours we were occupied in traversing a few hundred yards to the foot of the barrier. Then, turning about the corner of a wall-like outcropping of granite, we came upon a smooth area of 2 or 3 acres before the base of the towering pile of ice and rock that had baffled us for days, and before us beheld the dark and cavernous mouth of a cave. From this repelling portal the horrid stench was emanating, and as Van Dien espied the place he halted with an exclamation of profound astonishment. "By all my ancestors," he ejaculated, "that I should have lived to witness the reality of the fabled carrion caves. If these indeed be they, we have found a way beyond the ice barrier." The ancient chronicles of the first historians of Barsoom, so ancient that we have for ages considered them mythology, record the passing of the yellow men from the ravages of the green hordes that overran Barsoom as the drying up of the great oceans drove the dominant races from their strongholds. They tell of the wanderings of the remnants of this once powerful race, harassed at every step, until at last they found a way through the ice barrier of the north to a fertile valley at the pole. At the opening to the subterranean passage that led to their haven of refuge, a mighty battle was fought in which the yellow men were victorious, and within the caves that gave ingress to their new home they piled the bodies of the dead, both yellow and green, that the stench might warn away their enemies from further pursuit. And ever since that long-gone day have the dead of this fabled land been carried to the carrion caves, that in death and decay they might serve their country and warn away invading enemies. Here too is brought, so the fable runs, all the waste stuff of the nation, everything that is subject to rot, and that can add to the foul stench that assails our nostrils. And death lurks at every step among rotting dead, for here the fierce apes lair, adding to the putrid accumulation with the fragments of their own prey which they cannot devour. It is a horrid avenue to our goal, but it is the only one. You are sure, then, that we have found the way to the land of the yellow men? I cried. As sure as may be, he replied, having only ancient legend to support my belief. But see how closely, so far, each detail tallies with the world-old story of the Hegira of the yellow race. Yes, I am sure that we have discovered the way to their ancient hiding place. If it be true, and let us pray that such may be the case, I said, then here may we solve the mystery of the disappearance of Tardos Mors, Jedek of Helium, and Mors Kajak, his son, for no other spot upon Barsoom has remained unexplored by the many expeditions and the countless spies that have been searching for them for nearly 2 years. The last word that came from them was that they sought Carthoris, my own brave son, beyond the ice barrier. As we talked, we had been approaching the entrance to the cave, and as we crossed the threshold I ceased to wonder that the ancient green enemies of the yellow men had been halted by the horrors of that awful way. The bones of dead men lay man-high upon the broad floor of the first cave, and over all was a putrid mush of decaying flesh, through which the apes had beaten a hideous trail toward the entrance to the second cave beyond. The roof of this first apartment was low, like all that we traversed subsequently, so that the foul odors were confined and condensed to such an extent that they seemed to possess tangible substance. One was almost tempted to draw his short sword and hew his way through in search of pure air beyond. Can man breathe this polluted air and live? Asked de Van Dien, choking. Not for long, I imagine, I replied. So let us make haste. I will go first, and you bring up the rear, with Woola between. Come. And with the words I dashed forward, across the fetid mass of putrefaction. It was not until we had passed through 7 caves of different sizes and varying but little in the power and quality of their stenches that we met with any physical opposition. Then, within the 8th cave, we came upon a lair of apes. A full score of the mighty beasts were disposed about the chamber. Some were sleeping, while others tore at the fresh-killed carcasses of new-brought prey, or fought among themselves in their love-making. Here in the dim light of their subterranean home the value of their great eyes was apparent, for these inner caves are shrouded in perpetual gloom that is but little less than utter darkness. To attempt to pass through the midst of that fierce herd seemed even to me the height of folly, and so I proposed to Van Dien that he return to the outer world with Woola, that the two might find their way to civilization and come again with a sufficient force to overcome not only the apes, but any further obstacles that might lie between us and our goal. In the meantime, I continued, I may discover some means of winning my way alone to the land of the yellow men, but if I am unsuccessful, one life only will have been sacrificed. Should we all go on and perish, there will be none to guide a succoring party to Dija Thoris and your daughter. I shall not return and leave you here alone, John Carter, replied Van Dien. Whether you go on to victory or death, the Jeddak of Tarth remains at your side. I have spoken. I knew from his tone that it were useless to attempt to argue the question, and so I compromised by sending Woola back with a hastily penned note enclosed in a small metal case and fastened about his neck. I commanded the faithful creature to seek Carthoris at Helium, and though half a world and countless dangers lay between, I knew that if the thing could be done, Woola would do it. Equipped as he was by nature with marvelous speed and endurance, and with frightful ferocity that made him a match for any single enemy of the way, his keen intelligence and wondrous instinct should easily furnish all else that was needed for the successful accomplishment of his mission. It was with evident reluctance that the great beast turned to leave me in compliance with my command, and ere he had gone I could not resist the inclination to throw my arms about his great neck in a parting hug. He rubbed his cheek against mine in a final caress, and a moment later was speeding through the carrion caves toward the outer world. In my note to Carthoris, I had given explicit directions for locating the Carrion Caves, impressing upon him the necessity for making entrance to the country beyond through this avenue, and not to attempt under any circumstances to cross the ice barrier with a fleet. I told him that what lay beyond the 8th cave I could not even guess, but I was sure that somewhere upon the other side of the ice barrier his mother lay in the power of Matai Shang, and that possibly his grandfather and great-grandfather as well, if they lived. Further, I advised him to call upon Kulan Teeth and the son of Thuvandine for warriors and ships that the expedition might be sufficiently strong to ensure success at the first blow. And I concluded, if there be time, bring Taurus Tarkus with you, for if I live until you reach me, I can think of few greater pleasures than to fight once more shoulder to shoulder with my old friend. When Wula had left us, Thuvandine and I, hiding in the 7th cave, discussed and discarded many plans for crossing the 8th chamber. From where we stood, we saw that the fighting among the apes was growing less, and that many that had been feeding had ceased and lain down to sleep. Presently it became apparent that in a short time all the ferocious monsters might be peacefully slumbering, and thus a hazardous opportunity be presented to us to cross through their lair. One by one the remaining brutes stretched themselves upon the bubbling decomposition that covered the mass of bones upon the floor of their den, until but a single apt remained awake. This huge fellow roamed restlessly about, nosing among his companions in the abhorrent litter of the cave. Occasionally he would stop to peer intently toward first one of the exits from the chamber and then the other. His whole demeanor was as of one who acts as sentry. We were at last forced to the belief that he would not sleep while the other occupants of the lair slept, and so cast about in our minds for some scheme whereby we might trick him. Finally, I suggested a plan to Thuvandine, and as it seemed as good as any that we had discussed, we decided to put it to the test. To this end, Thuvandine placed himself close against the cave's wall, beside the entrance to the 8th chamber, while I deliberately showed myself to the guardian apt as he looked toward our retreat. Then I sprang to the opposite side of the entrance, flattening my body close to the wall. Without a sound, the great beast moved rapidly toward the 7th cave to see what manner of intruder had thus rashly penetrated so far within the precincts of his habitation. As he poked his head through the narrow aperture that connects the 2 caves, a heavy long sword was awaiting him upon either hand, and before he had an opportunity to emit even a single growl, his severed head rolled at our feet. Quickly we glanced into the 8th chamber. Not an apt had moved. Crawling over the carcass of the huge beast that blocked the doorway, Thuvandine and I cautiously entered the forbidding and dangerous den. Like snails, we wound our silent and careful way among the huge, recumbent forms. The only sound above our breathing was the sucking noise of our feet as we lifted them from the ooze of decaying flesh through which we crept. Halfway across the chamber, and one of the mighty beasts directly before me moved restlessly at the very instant that my foot was poised above his head, over which I must step. Breathlessly I waited, balancing upon one foot, for I did not dare move a muscle. In my right hand was my keen short sword, the point hovering an inch above the thick fur beneath which beat the savage heart. Finally the apt relaxed, sighing, as with the passing of a bad dream, and resumed the regular respiration of deep slumber. I planted my raised foot beyond the fierce head, and an instant later had stepped over the beast. Thuvandine followed directly after me, and another moment found us at the further door, undetected. The Carrion Caves consist of a series of 27 connecting chambers, and present the appearance of having been eroded by running water in some far-gone age when a mighty river found its way to the south through this single breach in the barrier of rock and ice that hems the country of the pole. Thuvandine and I traversed the remaining 19 caverns without adventure or mishap. We were afterward to learn that but once a month is it possible to find all the apts of the Carrion Caves in a single chamber. At other times they roam singly or in pairs in and out of the caves, so that it would have been practically impossible for 2 men to have passed through the entire 27 chambers without encountering an apt in nearly every one of them. Once a month they sleep for a full day, and it was our good fortune to stumble by accident upon one of these occasions. Beyond the last cave we emerged into a desolate country of snow and ice, but found a well-marked trail leading north. The way was boulder-strewn, as had been that south of the barrier, so that we could see but a short distance ahead of us at any time. After a couple of hours we passed round a huge boulder to come to a steep declivity leading down into a valley. Directly before us we saw a half-dozen men, fierce, black-bearded fellows, with skins the color of a ripe lemon. "The yellow men of Barsoom," ejaculated Thuvandine, as though even now that he saw them he found it scarce possible to believe that the very race we expected to find hidden in this remote and inaccessible land did really exist. We withdrew behind an adjacent boulder to watch the actions of the little party, which stood huddled at the foot of another huge rock, their backs toward us. One of them was peering round the edge of the granite mass as though watching one who approached from the opposite side. Presently the object of his scrutiny came within the range of my vision, and I saw that it was another yellow man. All were clothed in magnificent furs, the six in the black and yellow striped hide of the Orlog, while he who approached alone was resplendent in the pure white skin of an apt. The yellow men were armed with 2 swords, and a short javelin was slung across the back of each, while from their left arms hung coop-like shields no larger than a dinner plate, the concave sides of which turned outward toward an antagonist. They seemed puny and futile implements of safety against an even ordinary swordsman, but I was later to see the purpose of them, and with what wondrous dexterity the yellow men manipulate them. One of the swords which each of the warriors carried caught my immediate attention. I call it a sword, but really it was a sharp-edged blade with a complete hook at the far end. The other sword was of about the same length as the hooked instrument, and somewhere between that of my long sword and my short sword. It was straight and 2-edged. In addition to the weapons I have enumerated, each man carried a dagger in his harness. As the white-furred one approached, the 6 grasped their swords more firmly, the hooked instrument in the left hand, the straight sword in the right, while above the left wrist the small shield was held rigid upon a metal bracelet. As the lone warrior came opposite them, the 6 rushed out upon him with fiendish yells that resembled nothing more closely than the savage war cry of the Apaches of the Southwest. Instantly the attacked drew both his swords, and as the 6 fell upon him I witnessed as pretty fighting as one might care to see. With their sharp hooks the combatants attempted to take hold of an adversary, but like lightning the cup-shaped shield would spring before the darting weapon, and into its hollow the hook would plunge. Once the lone warrior caught an antagonist in the side with his hook, and drawing him close ran his sword through him. But the odds were too unequal, and, though he who fought alone was by far the best and bravest of them all, I saw that it was but a question of time before the remaining 5 would find an opening through his marvelous guard and bring him down. Now my sympathies have ever been with the weaker side of an argument, and though I knew nothing of the cause of the trouble, I could not stand idly by and see a brave man butchered by superior numbers. As a matter of fact, I presume I gave little attention to seeking an excuse, for I love a good fight too well to need any other reason for joining in when one is afoot. So it was that before Thuvendine knew what I was about, he saw me standing by the side of the white-clad yellow man, battling like mad with his 5 adversaries. This concludes the 4th part, of 8 total, of The Warlord of Mars, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.